Hello and welcome everyone to GAF Does Lockdown, a regular show where we discuss the ideas to survive the lockdown and destroy capitalism and maybe other topics. Um, this is our third episode where we'll be talking about the concept of dual power as a strategy to challenge the existing state and capitalism, build up from the mutual aid efforts that have been happening all over the UK and all over the world as a response to the virus. And to do that, we are going to have a guest speaker that's going to be introducing the topic to us. His name is M. And if you want to go ahead and introduce yourself or start speaking.
Hi. Angus was very good to introduce me just then. And basically, I'm going to be doing not too long, but reasonably dense introduction to the concept of dual power, which is basically a strategic concept that exists within mainly revolutionary left-wing theory. And due to various reasons, which I'll try and get into in the presentation, it's recently become a lot more prominent in discussion circles amongst leftists in the UK. I guess that's basically what most of this evening is going to be about. And as was explained to some of you earlier, there's going to be a bit of a Q&A afterwards. So it's not going to just be me talking nonstop. There is going to be a decent amount of audience participation. Angus, should I like get cracking now, or do you want to like run through a few things first?
Well, maybe remind people that, of course, if they're interested in anything we're talking about and they want to know more about GAF as a whole, they can, under the channel, wherever they're watching it, either Twitch now or on YouTube later, they'll be able to find links to our social media, to our website, to our GoFundMe, if you want to support us. And there you'll also be able to see that we have other events coming up, such as other live streams like this, reading groups, and anything else that may come up. So if anyone is interested, please check that out. But other than that, the floor is yours. So go ahead.
Okay. Well, what from my perspective, this topic has kind of not really been talked about that much by like militantly left-wing people in the UK at all recently, but it's been very popular in the US. So a lot of the research material which I've based this presentation on is based off of stuff that's been produced by libertarian socialists, communist, anarchist organizations over in the States. Particularly organizations that have paid a lot of attention to issues surrounding climate change. And as we get into the subject later on, it'll become apparent that this has some pretty direct relevance to how climate collapse is going to interact with capitalism. So I'll just start off by explaining why this has come to the fore. Basically, I think a large thing that has fed into this has been the recent explosion in mutual aid groups. And the other thing is that the main popular strategy for militant leftists in the UK up until about 2 months ago was generally considered to be like aggressive entryism and electoralism. And there's now a growing challenge to that consensus following on from the effective destruction of a large portion of the left wing of the Labour Party in over the course of December through February. So I better define what dual power is before we get into anything. This is a bit tricky because there's a lot of competing definitions, but the short bit that most people agree on is that dual power is this circumstance or a complex of things that emerges that challenges an existing state and challenges capitalism for the control over physical logistics, access to resources, and legitimate political decision making. And what that means is that there's like real social institutions like councils and distribution centers that are interlinked in like a complex and sophisticated way, and have an ability to direct their efforts in such a way that it directly challenges the state for their monopoly on social control. And this creates a situation where there's dual centers of power. hence the name. That's kind of the basic core of the concept. But beyond that, things start to get a bit more complicated because there's various different positions as to how dual power should be formed. And basically, I'm gonna take us through those. I have my own opinion on how it should be done in the UK context, but I'm going to take you through positions that I oppose or partially agree with as well. And the big caveat here is that because this topic has not been discussed much in the UK left recently, there is not really like a sophisticated interrogation of the idea existing here in the same way that there is over in the USA, where there's hundreds of leftists continuously talking about it and like pushing programs, actively doing practical things to build it. So in some ways, over here, we're rather behind, both practically and theoretically. So I'm basing my notes for this off of an essay I wrote that some of you might have read recently called Insurrection and Infrastructure, a Dual Power Guide for Leftists in Britain. And in it, I go through a basic list of what it is and what it isn't. And the main things I see dual power as being, the what it is side of that, is one, it's a strategic doctrine. It's like a framework of ideas of how to organize radical networks. Two, it's a type of method. It's a way of doing things. So that's because it's this doctrine, that means it's concerned with how organizations behave. And because it's concerned with how organizations behave, that also relates to like the wider movement's behavior and also to individual activists' behavior. So that's two aspects of the practical dimension. It's also a collection of physical institutions. So if you've got a dual power situation, you have to actually have stuff. You have to have food distribution. You have to have places where local councils can make decisions. It's not just kind of something that you can declare exists or declare that your political party or organization or federation has an allegiance to as a concept. It has to actually practically exist. It's not like saying, okay, well, our organization is directly democratic, because you could kind of opt into that relatively easily by just having a system whereby there's no internal representation. But if it's dual power, then there has to be a continuous maintenance and construction of physical organizations and physical social infrastructure. The other thing that really defines it is that it's defined as being against or in opposition to existing state and capital power. So it's not something that just exists on its own. It exists in a situation where there's been a sufficiently severe rupture in society that means that the state doesn't have or is unable to maintain its monopoly on all areas of, I guess, what you would call the social contract in the economy. So it would mean the state isn't able to provide certain services for whatever is in this complex of dual power institutions. They are able to compete in the provision of those services, whether it's things like healthcare or like even spiritual things. There's some arguments that dual power institutions should have a reasonable degree of integration with local religious groups. I actually disagree with that, but it's an opinion that's out there. So that's the kind of general definition of things that it includes. It's got to be theoretical concept. It's got to be like manifested in organizations. It has physical components as an essential requirement, and it necessarily has to be in opposition to something that already exists and is already the hegemonic power. What it isn't is a bit more tricky, because this is where the bickering comes in. So there's a lot of mutual aid groups right now, and I think I should stress up front that although mutual aid is generally considered by most leftists who are interested in this concept to be a pretty core part of dual power, just having a mutual aid group isn't enough. Mutual aid, on its own is good, and it can be performed in an anti-capitalist manner. But if it were to be part of dual power, then it has to be a part of a larger system that engages in this kind of really rather broad challenge, and it would have to be interlinked, both in terms of like the number of mutual aid institutions that were interlinked, and also in terms of the different qualities that those institutions had, the different things that they were able to do. So it wouldn't just be the existence of the groups. It would be that the sum of those groups was greater than, the whole form that those groups became was greater than the sum of their parts. So it's not synonymous with mutual aid, for one thing. It's also not synonymous with we don't see this in the UK or the US, but it's not synonymous with things like guerrilla war or like underground militant movements. You often find cases in Middle Eastern countries, South American countries, and certain areas of East Asia where there are leftists or other militant organizations who engage in strategies that are like dual power. And they engage in those strategies because they're doing various different forms of insurgency. However, that doesn't necessarily mean that it is synonymous with insurgency and guerrilla warfare. It can appear in the same situations, but sometimes it doesn't. And we'll get into this later because I'm going to do a brief case study of Hezbollah, which is a militant organization in the Middle East, which I'm sure most people have probably heard of. So, that being said, it's not something that can exist hand in hand with every strategy. Some strategies can exist with dual power as a component. For example, guerrilla strategies in the Middle East often have been known to do things like that. But there's some strategies which can't exist alongside it. So if you look at the contemporary habits of the British left, things like engaging with mainstream unions, which has recently had a massive uptick in popularity because of the fact that the government wants to end lockdown and everyone's screaming for people to join unions, which in general I'm in favour of, being an industrial unionist. But it's not something that is necessarily going to go hand in hand with methods of organisation that engage with components of the establishment, which most mainstream unions, like say PCS, would be a part of. So if your political organisation is saying, okay, we've all got to join this particular civic institution in order to influence it from the inside, because of the fact that that strategy is inherently buying into a component of establishment power complexes, it is inherently at odds with the core of a dual power strategy, which is to set up alternative institutions and alternative sites of control. So there are limitations to a dual power strategy. And whether or not those limitations are critical for you, you're ultimately going to have to decide. And the last thing, given that I've just mentioned Hezbollah, I should stress this quite clearly. Dual power is not something that leftists have a monopoly on. In the essay which I wrote, I also mentioned that there's fascist organizations in Ukraine who've also utilized similar strategies of building community-based institutions, which give them toeholds in local communities and within political infrastructure. And they orientate that system in such a way that they have their own area of influence outside the government, and they kind of approach it in a both within and against the state type of manner. So you should bear in mind that everything that I've applied here is something that our enemies can and do use. So unless there's anything immediately rising out of that Angus wants to pick up on, I'm gonna continue going on. I'm gonna go through a brief kind of like explanation of how the concept of dual power emerged, and how various different elements of it from various different ideological influences, like like old school leftist ideological influences like Leninism and like classical anarchism, have kind of coalesced over the course of the 20th century. So yeah, unless Angus wants to pick up on anything like right off the bat, I'm going to continue there.
No, go ahead. It's, you're doing very well yourself.
Thank you. I'm kind of winging it a bit, so it's good that it's coming across well. I guess I'll find out in the Q&A if anyone's got some searing criticism.
We're extremely winging this all the time.
Big mood. Okay, so the phrase dual power kind of emerged in the Russian Revolution. I'm pretty sure that it was coined. I'm pretty sure it was either coined by Lenin, or Trotsky, but certainly Lenin and Trotsky were two of the earliest theorists to talk about. The whole concept originated in kind of the situation that the Russian population, particularly the metropolitan Russian population, found itself in 1917. And there was this, the situation was that the provisional government, which is what took over from the Tsar after he was forced to abdicate and was subsequently kicked out, found itself in a situation where, although in theory state legitimacy resided with Kerensky, who was the leader of the provisional government, there was also this other completely separate locus of power, which was the workers' Soviets. And basically, the workers' Soviets had such a pre-made level of legitimacy with the population because of the power of the emergent workers' revolutionary movement, which had been going for decades in Russia and had already attempted a revolution in 1905. They were able to establish reasonably effective political decision-making centers. And what happened in the course of the next few months was that various different theorists, not just the big names like Lenin and Trotsky, but it was also talked about by various other people, noticed that this dual power situation had emerged, that it was no longer the sole preserve of the provisional government to make decisions of state, to make decisions of economic responsibility, of political responsibility. And they analyzed it through a lens of class struggle, and it heavily influenced the Bolshevik decisions going forward and how they were treating the workers' Soviets going on. As we know from history, things kind of ended up getting a bit messy in that regard, but that's a long and complicated passage that doesn't need delving into in any great detail. Essentially, I've got a quote from Lenin here, who said, "This dual power is evident in the existence of two governments. One is main, the actual government of the bourgeoisie, the provisional government of Lvov and company, which holds in its hands all the organs of power. The other is supplementary and parallel government, controlling government in the shape of the Petrograd Soviet of Workers' and Soldiers' Deputies, which holds no organs of state power, but directly rests on the support of an obvious and indisputable majority of the people, on the armed workers and soldiers." So that was Lenin's take on the position. He wrote that in a piece that he issued at the time called "The Peculiar Nature of the Dual Power." And I think, arguably you could quibble with whether or not he was correct in saying that there was an indisputable majority. You can argue whether or not he was correct in saying that most people even recognized the provisional government as being legitimate, but that was the situation as he saw it. It was the situation Bolsheviks saw it. And as a result, the concept survived as a pretty core part of Leninist theory. But dual power isn't the sole preserve of any one body of ideology. There's also heavy influence on the concept going forward from here, from the other components of the left-wing spectrum. So like more moderate components of the social democratic movement, which is what the communist movement was known up until the end of the second decade of the 20th century. Particularly the German social democrats also had their own more, I guess we would call slightly more liberal ideas about how dual power would operate. And also there's the very obvious influence, which I've already mentioned, of anarchist ideas surrounding mutual aid, which are, I would imagine, sufficiently well known in the audience to this discussion that they don't need going into here. But suffice to say, anarchist praxis has had a pretty defining influence on the development of dual power as a theoretical concept. However, at the time and up until the middle of the 20th century, the concept was mainly talked about in Marxist circles, and the change in anarchist thinking to directly attacking the concept and directly engaging with it has only happened more recently in the last 3 or 4 decades. And one of the main protagonists in making that happen is everyone knows who Murray Bookchin is, or most people do. Yeah, it's him, and he often turns up in discussions of left-wing anarchism and particularly left-wing ecological movements in the late 20th century because he's been such an influential thinker. Bookchin's contributions to the ideas of dual power are pretty key. I actually disagree with some of them. I disagree with some of his positions, but there is no denying that if he hadn't written about them to the degree that he has, it's likely the anarchist movement would not be as interested in this concept as it is. He also viewed dual power as being primarily about political decision making. But until relatively recently, the infrastructural side of it, the infrastructural side of the definition that I gave earlier, was mainly interested in decision-making infrastructure, in councils, in like how to hold votes, how to have legitimate quorums, and that kind of thing. It was an idea about having a popular sovereignty, an independent, challenging popular sovereignty, and these are things that Bookchin was really interested in, because he was very interested in how revolutionary thinking could interact with ideas around municipalities and cities. But the other main change that he introduced, other than that, was kind of twofold. First of all, it was that there was a slight increase in the tendency to think about dual power as being something that would have its own effect on how we do things on a very personal level. So there was it was part of the ecological thinking in Bookchin's philosophy. So that began to seep into thoughts around dual power around the time that he was making his interventions on the subject. The other main change that he's responsible for is dual power becoming a program. So the Leninist way of thinking about it up until then was mainly, I mean, it was integrated with their ideas of a revolutionary program. Most Leninists up until relatively recently would have said that dual power is something that will emerge in a revolutionary situation. But they weren't really thinking of it as something that they would chase as a policy program, as a specific component of a revolutionary movement. Bookchin kind of changed that. He made it a pretty intrinsically programmatic concept. It was because of his ideas of like self-forming independent municipal councils that it became this idea of something that would be proactively produced even prior to revolutionary situations. And that was pretty important, because once that happened, it kind of opened the door for introducing debates about what the component of that program would be. And that is how the influence of kind of like mutual aid thinking and wider thinking about ecological concepts began to become introduced into dual power as an idea. So by the mid 20th century, we've got people like Murray Bookchin and other anarchist thinkers have begun to think about this, but it hasn't really become a core part of the movement. But theory isn't the only thing that happened in the 20th century. There was also a hell of a lot of interesting stuff, not the least quite a few revolutionary movements. There's a few that are quite critical to understanding the modern conception of dual power. The most famous one in left-wing circles is probably the Black Panthers. I'll spend a brief period of time on this, because the Black Panthers are a sufficiently complex topic that they would probably deserve their own talk. But basically, they had this program that was based around developing community kitchens, developing independent food support, independent education programs, and that program enabled them to build a wide social base within the communities that they were within the communities which they were active or allied with. And because it was linked to the armed component of their movement, it remained a relatively revolutionary thing up until the dissolution of the Panthers in the late 80s. Some of the food programs developed by the Panthers actually survived the party's demise towards the end of the 80s. I think there may even be some legacy programs still existing. And I would imagine that the remaining components of the Black Panthers, like the United Panther movement, are probably still quite active in that regard. Certainly, dual power as an idea has remained quite strong in African American revolutionary leftism. You can actually look at quite a lot of American Maoists who are quite interested in this concept. And speaking of Maoists, that is another key area, because the Maoist interest in guerrilla warfare, which I mentioned previously, is also pretty closely interlinked with ideas around dual power and forming independent areas of sovereignty within the people. So there's this kind of emerging trend in the 20th century within like the more kind of hardline and active and militant left-wing revolutionary organizations in the West to slowly begin orienting themselves around ideas that are connected to these concepts of like political insurgency against state sovereignty and connecting that to infrastructural programs. As I've said earlier many times now, guerrilla warfare isn't something that's synonymous with dual power, and dual power isn't something that's the sole preserve of leftism. And there's a reason why I'm saying this. It's because you can have types of militancy and types of political agitation that utilize dual power strategies, where they're utilizing them in a fundamentally reactionary way. And I'm going to look at those right now because we've had a brief discussion of the Maoist stuff, which was pretty critical. You can look at Indian Maoists, for example, who even managed to get to the point of producing serious infrastructure, things like dams, things like roads, and even their own, well, arguably their own taxation system. Well, exactly the same thing can be done by any armed group that is able to exert a significant amount of control over resources. The case study which I've chosen is Hezbollah. The reason for this is that Hezbollah is arguably one of the most successful political militant forces on the planet. I would personally describe them as being what we would if they were something existed in the West, we would probably describe them as a fascist group. They're certainly reactionary. Hezbollah is a very hardline and sectarian Islamist political organization. It's largely a militia, but it also exists as a political party in Lebanon, and it has a sufficiently developed degree of political and physical infrastructure that means that it can interact with states in the way that other states do. It is considered to be a peer in terms of its influence to many smaller governments. So how does it do dual power? Well, it does it in a few ways. First of all, it has a wide network connected to its military wing of things like regional councils, right down to a district level. It's got its own law enforcement system. It's got its own methods of resolving local conflicts, of interpersonal conflicts between local people that might be having a dispute over business or property or other similar kind of community issues. It provides wells, or rather, it provides the control of wells, would be more accurate. It has employment programs, health clinics, schools. It has a certain degree of integration with some parts of the labor movement. It'll build people's houses under certain circumstances, and it does these things for a reason. It does these things because those things integrate it so deeply within the community that it's considered itself to be rooted in, that it makes it an integral part of politics. An integral part of politics in a way that is kind of beyond what a normal political party would be. It essentially controls significant components of the economy and of society. And because of that, on several occasions, it has been able to effectively challenge the Lebanese state for control over entire subsections of the economy. And this is made more powerful by the fact that Hezbollah, not being a revolutionary force in the way that leftists would define revolution, is perfectly happy to integrate itself within existing state structures. It exists as a political party as well, and specifically a political party that competes in electoral terms. Here we can't do that. Most militant leftists would agree that reformism has a half-life. Being reactionary doesn't really have that same limitation. You can be as opportunistic as you like. That's exactly what they do. They integrate their dual power system with their other strategies. It gives them a massive amount of social leverage. It gives them a massive amount of control over the economy, and it enables them to dictate terms to political opponents. And it enables them to do that in a locus of decision-making that's outside of central government control and is within their sphere of influence. other reactionary groups also try this. The other example, which I wrote about in the essay, is Ukrainian neo-Nazi groups. Ukrainian neo-Nazis have exploded over the last few years as a result of the war in Ukraine. The most famous of them internationally is a group called the Azov Battalion, or just Azov. They're not remotely as well developed as Hezbollah, but they're essentially following that same kind of program of trying to pursue a state within a state, of trying to develop certain elements of their own social infrastructure, running children's camps, providing certain elements of social services, particularly targeted towards veterans, and integrating that with the armed political wing of their movement, which means that the legitimacy for the explicitly fascist things that they do is linked to the legitimacy of their community infrastructure systems. These things are pretty powerful tools in the hands of reactionaries, and they can be pretty powerful tools in the hands of leftists too. So I think that's enough of the depressing talk about how the bad guys are doing it better than us for now. Let's talk about some new developments. Quite a lot of the development in thinking about dual power has happened over the last 2 decades, particularly since the kind of emergence of the modern, new, younger left-wing movement, which kind of really began to get its teeth towards the end of the Bush era, sort of had its embryonic appearance in the, I'm talking about in the West specifically here, had its embryonic appearance, particularly around kind of the kickoff of the recession in 2008, around the Occupy movement exploding. And back then it was still a protest movement, and people were talking about these concepts in a very abstract fashion. There's some writing from, as early as kind of 2003 up until 2011 that mentions the concept of dual power, that mentions the concept of independent democratic institutions. And that was part of what the Occupy movement tried to do. But, ultimately the Occupy movement is most famous for failing. Again, another discussion that could be gone into at length. But the thing that the emergence of the New Left movement really encouraged was a massive explosion in young people getting involved both in organization and theory. And this meant that they were kind of separated from existing organizations, because towards the end of the Cold War, most of the established left-wing organizations in Europe really got hammered. They functionally got obliterated. The only wings of the movement that really survived particularly well were the anarchists, which kind of managed to claw back some territory in the political sphere towards the end of the 90s. And that really came to the fore during the period of the emergence of the new left-wing movement that we're now part of today, because quite a lot of the people who got into it went into it from the libertarian side of the spectrum. It's not universally the case. The non-libertarian components of the left, like the Marxist, Leninist, Trotskyist, Maoist components, they also were quite heavily strengthened, particularly in the US. But the general effect of this was that people began to engage in things in essentially a free-for-all. There was a theoretical free-for-all, and people were just engaging with a vast array of different kinds of texts, of different kinds of organization methods. There was a complete melting pot. And that's continued up until the present day. And what it meant was that people were willing and able to take influences from any source that they thought was reasonable. And this massively expanded the scope of how people think about these things. It meant that thinking about concepts like dual power suddenly became not a thing that was just dominated by a particular tendency or a particular famous thinker. It became something that people were willing to add to themselves. And when we got to maybe the last decade or so, this tendency to improvise, to develop independent theory ideas really came to the fore. And it resulted in, particularly in the United States, emergent political forces on the far left developing their own doctrines, their own programs for action. Again, as a result of a significant amount of electoral projects in the US being demolished, a lot of the programs that have been talked about a lot more have been programs surrounding revolutionary theory. And because dual power has a pretty solid theoretical basis and a large body of text already existed for it, it became popular in American new left-wing political circles. As a result, most of the dominant groups within the modern resurgent American left that aren't primarily focused on electoral campaigning at least talk about dual power. Quite a lot of them actively try to build it. There's the Democratic Socialists of America are an organization which people kind of get into arguments about constantly. They've got a variety of internal factions. Some of the more influential of these factions are heavy proponents of dual power strategies. There's also other organizations in the US, like the rather popular anarchist groups like Symbiosis or Black Rose, Rosa Negra, have also heavily pushed for dual power / mutual aid oriented methods of organizing, combined with like things like deep organizing models, community action, and that kind of long-termist approach to building revolutionary capacity. The other thing that came out of this was that during the aftermath of the recession, infrastructure for working class people in the USA was basically terrible. I mean, it was terrible before that, but it got significantly worse. And as a result of that, there began to be a lot of discussion in American leftist circles about how to provide for this lack of infrastructure. And that has indelibly affected the concept of dual power. In most modern writing, it's now considered to be inextricable from providing local services, from providing things like food, from integrating food kitchens with local first aid networks, with like disaster relief mutual aid networks, with relieving austerity, with integrating with like grassroots unions, that kind of thing. I think that essentially brings us up to the present day. And it also makes it quite clear how this concept is quite core to modern revolutionary thinking about ecology and modern revolutionary thinking about how we should adapt to climate collapse. Over the last, several decades, as research about climate collapse has become a lot more widespread, a lot more tangible, a lot more popularly understood, particularly amongst people who are politically committed to paying attention to it, it has become clear that climate collapse isn't just going to, it's not just going to like make things hotter. It's going to have a number of complex, interacting, qualitative effects. Some of these things are going to be things like increasing the degree and rate of hurricanes within certain areas of the globe. That's a special case that exists in certain geographical zones. But what it's going to do across the board is essentially demolish food access in the medium term. I'm talking about the next kind of 2 or 3 decades. The ability to produce food en masse is going to collapse. This is because cereal cropping, which is essentially what global food supply is based on, is going to stop being functionally viable. This has not escaped the notice of the kind of people who are talking about dual power. And indeed, when you look at a lot of people who are talking about it and a lot of programs from organizations such as the Libertarian Socialist Caucus is one of the main programs out there. It's one of the more popularly known ones. They're a component of the DSA. They talk a lot about counter institutions, about alternative institutions. Those kinds of alternative institutions are inevitably going to be primarily oriented around adapting structural crises. The chief structural crisis that is going to be incoming is access to very, very basic physical needs. It'll depend on where you are, but those things are going to basically be things like access to water, access to healthcare, access to housing, and access to food. Last year, the central plains of the USA suffered a massive series of floods. These essentially destroyed a large quantity of that year's cereal crops. This year with COVID, we've seen that there's been a severe hit to a lot of components of mass agriculture because they can't get the workers to get the food out of the fields. COVID looks quite bad right now, and it is quite bad. But it is not as bad as crises can get. We know that because, you know, we're the kinds of people who all turn up to green anti-capitalist front Zoom sessions, so we're all doomers basically. But I think it should not escape notice that the degree and the qualities of crisis are going to exert themselves in ways that essentially disrupt the food supply, and particularly disrupt the food supply in terms of how it interacts with capitalist logistics. If it's disrupting capitalist logistics, then that means that capitalism stops being able to provide certain forms of food. And then it stops being able to provide all forms of food in certain areas. This means that not even the psychological legitimacy of capitalist states will collapse, but any semblance of control or influence they'll have over particular areas of the globe will collapse. That means that either nothing will step in to take its place, which means that people will fall over dead because they will have died of starvation or dehydration or preventable diseases or unpreventable diseases, or there will be an alternative infrastructure that takes over. I've already demonstrated that reactionary groups are perfectly capable of establishing their own infrastructures. In theory, it is possible for us to do that. It's my position that we should. It's my position that we should do this in a manner that is very deliberately divorced from our current rather reformist ways of doing things. Those who know me personally will know that I'm consistently complaining about the opportunity cost inherent in certain strategies. I think that we are the victims of those opportunity costs. I think we've lost a lot of time in being able to construct the infrastructure that we should have because we've focused on mainly electoral projects in the USA and the UK. And I think that going forward, we're going to have to face in the short term a very kind of hard and stark choice between what we want the opportunity cost to be. Do we want to give up the chance to develop popularly legitimate electoral power in the short term, if we're lucky? Or do we want to put in the effort to build long-term infrastructural power that creates its own legitimacy in the long term, given what we think we know is going to happen in the long term? The big question is how we construct it in a Western context. Particularly in the UK, this will be quite difficult because we haven't invested a lot of time in building the components of things that could create a dual power situation within the next 20, 30 years. We do have some stuff. The modern mutual aid movement has provided us with a lot of kind of on-the-ground training in how to do very, very basic, coordinated, low-level logistics, and how to coordinate messaging, how to coordinate things like good advice for very basic healthcare. We've got a reasonably good grassroots union movement. Some of the components of the grassroots union movement are revolutionary. Some of the components of the grassroots union movement are more inclined to cooperate with political parties. We've got not that many people, but it's quite clear that the degree of radicalization in Western societies is really amping up. We can influence what direction that radicalization goes in, and we can influence how that radicalization expresses itself organizationally. I think we've got to be prepared to be adaptative, and we've got to be prepared to put in some rather complicated systems and to put in a reasonably high degree of effort compared to what we have previously been doing. But it's my opinion that dual power strategies are basically the only legitimate and theoretically reinforceable set of strategies that can guarantee control over the kinds of parts of politics that we need to have any degree of success going forward. My throat's getting a little sore. I've reached the end of my notes. And I think once I've got to the point where I'm having my own little ideological ramble, it's time for me to have a little drink of water and wait for some comments and questions. So I think I'll pass it back to Angus.
Yeah, thank you very much. That was really, really excellent. I touched on topics I wasn't expecting to, which is really nice, on topics of collapse and arguing for a more revolutionary thinking versus and abandoning a bit of the reformist or electoral route, which is something a lot of us have been like thinking about or saying for a while, but you did it like very like matter of hand, like this is our only hope, which I very much agree with. But yeah, I don't want to also like say much more because we had a lot of a single person talking for a while, and so I want to give the floor now to people in the call to raise their hand if they want to ask some questions, or they want to do a small contribution as well. And also, if people listening on the stream want to write something on the chat, I'll try to bring that up as well. But I already see a hand raise. Alex, would you like to unmute yourself and say something?
Yes, so yeah, I have a question. So you mentioned that a lot of far right groups use dual power. How would be the best way to combat these groups when they employ these strategies?
That is a very interesting question. The difficulty about that is that the two case studies I looked at emerged in situations where there was already civil wars in progress. I'm an anti-fascist. Quite a lot of other people in the Green Anti-Capitalist Front are also anti-fascists. Our general position is that most of the time, you unless you can stop it before it starts, you're kind of fucked. However, it's notable that the two things that I perceived as being the most successful case studies of reactionary movements doing this only emerged when there was already a war in progress, and that war had significant international involvement from other powers that were trying to influence the way that things were going. So Hezbollah, for example, has heavy backing from a number of regional governments. Like until the Syrian civil war kicked off, they were being backed by Syria. It's now kind of the other way around, and they're reinforcing the Syrian government. Their main backers have always been the Iranians. In the case of the Ukrainian neo-Nazis, there's kind of a symbiotic relationship between the Ukrainian neo-Nazis and certain organs of state. They existed as kind of like the equivalent, the Ukrainian equivalent of local neo-Nazi football gangs. That was the original social basis of them. There was a strong far-right presence in the country already, and that presence was able to coagulate and form around sophisticated organizers and sophisticated organizations. So I would say that if you want to nip that sort of thing in the bud, then that's the best way to do it. You need to get there while they're attempting to develop their institutions. Once they've done it, it is entirely a matter of who is stronger. And that essentially means that you are looking at a conventional kinetic conflict, which is not good, because normally states tend to reinforce reactionary third parties rather than they prefer to reinforce revolutionary third parties. There is a reason why Hezbollah has managed to be so successful for so long, and it's because they're very good at what they do, and none of the local opposition groups who would be able to challenge them have been able to exert a degree of force in opposition to them to sufficiently degrade them.
Yeah, maybe something else to add is that another example that I think about when I've seen something similar of far-right groups using this kind of strategies is in Spain, which is a place where they don't really use the the expression dual power, but I think it's because the tradition itself is something that came from like a different perspective from like the Spanish Revolution.
Most groups that use things that I would describe as dual power often don't even refer to it as that phrase. They might not even be aware of it.
Yeah, in Spain they will call it just auto-organización or self-organization, which is, you know, like goes back to the many years. But in recent years, and also like after the, you know, the crisis, the world crisis and all of this, there were several examples of far-right groups setting up things like food banks or food distribution services, very, you know, that look very similar to what leftist groups were doing. And that was like, you know, a huge influx of people, and it made the news, and it gave them quite a bit of like legitimacy. And I think one of the things that we have to take in mind is that these groups, they are, because of their you know, what their political objectives are, these are never like there's always going to be a through line of exclusion and racism or xenophobia going through the organization. So, for example, in Spain, these food services will only be provided for you know, white Spanish nationals.
There is an inherent built-in limitation to the degree that kind of system would be able to integrate itself within the broader community.
Yeah, of course.
And
so
arguably that is a weakness in some ways, but
yeah,
they are designing for a supremacist model, so they don't care about that, and they see it as an advantage.
Yeah, but I think early on that kind of like weakness, or that kind of like you know, predisposition makes it like you have the opportunity to expose it and attack it, and kind of rally like anti-racist or communities to rally immigrant communities and whoever, you know, will be affected by all of this, and kind of like, you know, try to destroy them early on. As you say, once they're established, yeah.
Across the board, any kind of community organizing model is almost always weakest when it's embryonic. Let's see, we've got a couple of other questions in the group chat.
Yeah, let's move on maybe.
Okay, there's one from GAF London. Is that from you, Angus?
No,
no, that's me.
Oh, okay, sorry. Go ahead.
Yeah, I just wanted to ask, what do you see as some of the main opportunities and main pitfalls and risks, both in like short term and long term, of kind of moving the mutual aid networks into like a more long term dual power sort of thing? And do you even think that's possible, or do you think that the mutual aid networks are not even something that could transition into that?
I have gone back and forth on this subject. I think the mutual aid networks have been a really interesting phenomenon. I think that we can probably, as a movement, as the militant left of the movement, can probably exert enough influence to keep a decent chunk of them sufficiently radical and to interlink them that they could form some kind of like very, very embryonic component of what might become dual power later. But that's a statement that's filled with like ifs and buts and equivocations. I think we've got to be really quite pragmatic about how we view the mutual aid movement. It's highly likely that the mutual aid movement that we see right now is a transitory phenomenon, and that the bulk of it is going to disappear except for the most organized organizations. I think given that, we need to, as a group, really kind of intelligently and introspectively look at what our capacities are in relation to it, because otherwise even the tiny amount of long-term potential that it might or might not have will be squandered. I think we should certainly try. I think it has potential. I think that most of it will probably kind of fall away as time goes by. Let's see, we've got another question from Rolf, and one from Gritcha. Am I pronouncing that correctly?
Yeah,
sorry, was that an okay answer to that, by the way?
Yeah, that was a really good answer. Yeah, and yeah, it's largely what I've been thinking as well.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Pardon me. I'm not entirely certain I'm pronouncing this name correctly. I think it's pronounced Gritia or Gritia. And so that person had asked, what about counter recruitment? I assume this is in reference to the discussion we had about reactionary movements. If not, by all means, type away, and I'm willing to read out what you're saying. Okay, it is. Yeah, counter recruitment is effective. There's like I would say there's like a barrier to entry in terms of counter recruitment, in terms of like the organization that is doing the counter recruiting, or the movement that is doing the counter recruiting, does have to have a certain level of capabilities to do it. But it would be an effective tactic against embryonic fascistic community organizing. I'm of the opinion that it's probably something that we should develop a skill set in as a wider anti-capitalist movement. What is it that Rolf wanted to ask?
Hi, thanks very much for that. I wanted to ask, you talked a bit about essentially building parallel supply chains to capitalist. I mean, looking at the mutual aid groups that exist, they're currently essentially doing last mile transportation from supermarkets to individuals. Do you think there is a clear route to building parallel, logistics networks and supply chains? And what would you say would be the first steps towards building those networks?
I think the answer to that question varies according to what is in the supply chain. For food, I think we can look at various bits of the supply and production process, and we will be able to see various different kinds of anti-capitalist alternatives, which are kind of prototypes. Like there are existing models for prototyping this sort of thing that have been tried in like Western left-wing contexts for quite a few decades now. Like the last point of distribution being when the food is given to someone. That's what we're doing right now, and it's what gets done with food kitchens. The real question is, can you get the initial site of production, and can you get the intermediary logistical stuff before the final distribution node? And that means having things like storage centers, having things that can do bulk transports. Right now we can do kind of like medium, low level domestic bulk. Like you might know a guy with a van in the mutual aid network who can ship a couple of multi-kilo bags of rice over to a community center for the soup kitchen, for example. That's good. It's the kind of thing that we should be doing more. It is clearly not of the scale that would be required in the future. I think there is a potential series of paths. I don't think that any of them are clear. And I think that one of the main things that is obscuring what those paths look like is the question of how we control the mid-level supply chain and what kind of goods are going into it. If we're talking about growing food, whatever type of food it might be, there is a very wide-ranging set of production requirements for the various different kinds of foods. I think it should be quite clear that we are not going to be in a position anytime soon when we are seizing control of farms. So there are certain types of crops which we are just not going to be able to produce en masse. We are not going to have our own like rice, wheat, cereal cultivation centers, particularly not anytime in the next decade. That would be my personal basic assumption. What we could start doing is having integrated community networks of like low to mid-level food production. That might be achievable within a few years in certain limited areas, and that could form a functioning prototype. But again, it's something that it's a speculation, and it's kind of peppered with if. So it very much hinges on how future crises evolve in relation to food supply, and how future organizational developments evolve within the anti-capitalist movement, and how that integrates with whatever survives of the current mutual aid
movement. Next, we have Mark O'Leary. if you want to unmute yourself and ask your question or to continue.
Hi, thank you. So yeah, it seems like dual power at the moment is sort of an aspirational thing that like a lot of the talk is what could be possible in the future, but is there like a concrete step that you think should be done tomorrow or like after this call?
It's true that the bulk of the theory is largely speculative, and most of the programs that have been put out there don't really talk about like how we get to the final thing in terms of like an ABC step-by-step guide. I think there are things that we can do tomorrow. It's very much a situation of Rome not being built in a day. The things that I think we should do tomorrow are strengthening very, very specific components of the anti-capitalist movement. Because dual power has this simultaneous focus on social legitimacy and provision of services, you kind of need both of those things to develop hand in hand. We are in a position where leftists can get together and talk about how they might organize a food kitchen. We are in a position where there's decent grassroots unions that could serve as like basic jumping off points for getting food supply. We're in a position where there's a massive increase in the popularity of tenants unions, and those tenants unions so far are being reasonably militant. These are the kinds of things that we could, with effort and with commitment of leftist organizers, coalesce into being reasonably cooperative and reasonably interlinked. If you've got a local movement that is concerned with like renters' sovereignty, and there's a lot of community buy-in, and if you've got like grassroots union members who are really committed to organizing specific kinds of workplaces, and those movements are at least to some degree in communication with each other, and that means that if they're overlapping in a particular area, then you've got something that could be turned into a resource distribution network, particularly if that's integrated with other kinds of community organizing. What I think we need to do to get to that point, and what I think could be done, within the next year, which in strategic terms is what tomorrow means, is that I think we need to strengthen the links between the grassroots unions and the grassroots tenants unions. We need to strengthen the radicalism of both of those movements. And we need to construct, because we don't really have it right now, a wide range of food distribution centers, food kitchens, and get a lot more integrated with the food bank system than the UK leftist movement is right now. Food banks are ubiquitous in this country. The presence of the radical left in food banks is not ubiquitous. The kinds of people who need food banks are the kinds of people who need grassroots renters unions, grassroots workers unions. Those workers unions can perform some of the decision-making processes that might eventually evolve to become independent popular sovereignty if there is a critical collapse of state functionality within the 2040s or the 2030s or the 2050s. So I think if there is one concrete next step project, it is people integrating their efforts in relation to grassroots unions and food kitchens and food banks. And then you can start talking about the mid-range infrastructure, and then you can integrate that with existing and expanding domestic community organized food production.
Thanks a lot. We also have a question from P.
Yeah. Thank you, Em, for that. I really enjoyed the talk. It was like very detailed and clear. And I am slowly reading through the article, which I'm also enjoying a lot with all the links and the extra information, which is giving a lot of food for thought. And maybe I'm getting ahead here, and what I'm thinking too far in the future, because as you say, this sort of thing doesn't take a year or 2 years. It's counted in decades, really, how to set it up. But I've been thinking that if you want to actually, on the service side of offering people what they need to survive, if you want to create a parallel structure to that of the state and the capitalist system, basically what people need is housing, food, energy, and healthcare. But all of those, especially the housing and food part, are linked to land and property and to money. And that's a big problem, especially in the UK, where land and property is all in the hands of the very, very few. And it's like, and in a place like London, it's almost impossible in any way for any group to, I mean, how do you raise enough money to be able to build your own alternative housing community without yourself becoming a capitalist?
Which is a perennial problem, which often emerges in progressive movements.
Yeah, so I'm just kind of struggling with like how, I mean, because taking something over, like squatting something, is fine, but it's not really long term, and it's not really viable long term if you're going to have to move constantly. Like if you want to really create an alternative housing structure for people, like to house people outside of this system. Not everybody will be able to move every couple of months. Some people will need them.
This is a very legitimate question, and it goes right to the core of whether or not this strategy is viable. The reality is that if we were just talking about outcompeting capitalism in terms of our ability to produce social services, you can forget about it. We're not going to be able to do it, not in the time scale. However, the key component about how dual power situations emerge is that they emerge when serious crises occur, so that they're essentially exploiting gaps. So there is a preparatory component to what a dual power program should in theory look like. According to people like me and people who think like me. I don't have a monopoly on this idea any more than anybody else does. But there's a preparatory component in terms of like there are certain kinds of infrastructure you can prepare in advance, or you can prepare prior to serious crises, and I mean crises that are more serious than the ones that we're having now. And there's certain kinds of things that you have to do while those crises are in effect. If we're talking about seizing property, then that is the basic component of any kind of like really anti-capitalist revolutionary program, because that's the seizing the means of production bit, particularly with housing. Particularly with land to grow food. That is proper classic seizing the means stuff. That is not going to be something that happens outside of revolutionary situations. So the aspect of dual power, which is about moments of rupture, which is about kind of like these moments of like emerging weaknesses, has to be really willing to exploit suddenly developing weaknesses in state apparatus. And for that reason, it has to be, so there's the word opportunism is very widely decried in left-wing circles because it has a very specific meaning. But in this sense, I'm meaning it in a different sense. You would have to be opportunistic in the way that you exploit gaps created by crisis in order to get to the point of being able to coalesce the kinds of bits of a dual power institution that you're talking about. Can we do the bit where we're seizing housing now? No. Can we do it in 5 years? Almost certainly not on a widespread level. Could we do it in a situation where the state is no longer able to supply food and is no longer able to coordinate all of the state security forces? Maybe, if we've done enough preparatory work. So it's about a combination of preparatory efforts and kind of ruthlessly exploitative aggression. Fundamentally, I think like what we got to view dual power as being is that it's a very patient but fundamentally aggressive strategy of attack. And because of that, I think we've got to realize that there's some things that it won't be able to do during a preparatory period that it will have to do during a period of rupture.
Cool. So, is there any other question? I know there has been some contributions in the chat, but I'm not seeing any other question. Does anyone want to add anything, any kind of contribution, or just ask anything? We are getting close to the time limit in a way. Okay, so we have Alex wants to speak again. Okay, there were several people.
I'm just looking at the chat again. Someone's mentioned permacultural models of food production. Yes, I think permacultural models are essential to food production, because the agricultural model is clearly something that we're not going to be able to exploit long term, even if we could seize control of it.
Yeah, this is something on GAF we have been discussing for a while. I think Katie wants to say something. If you want to unmute yourself. I'm not able to hear you, Katie, right now. I don't know if you're not muted, but I cannot hear you.
Who is it that's trying to speak?
Katie, I think. They have their hand raised, but sorry, I cannot hear you. I don't know. I think you may have some technical problem with your microphone.
Okay, Katie, if you want, so we're not getting your audio, but if you want to type out your question in the chat, then yeah, I'm very happy to read that out. I'll just read it out so that it's here for the audio log as well. Don't worry, it's not your fault. These things happen.
But yeah, there's also several comments going on in the chat about how the left, or all the left wants to do is wear black, and this is like a lot of work, which is true. It can be true sometimes. I think Katie wants to talk something about coordination across the radical left, which is very interesting. Something that has been like happening more in recent years, hopefully. But yeah, it's still a difficult one. And someone was also saying in the chat that that the left needs to get better at caring for each other on a basic level before we can do this. Which
Yes,
there's definitely some truth to that.
That was Finn's comment. I think that is certainly very true, and it belies the fact that the left does not have a very good degree of organizational sophistication or discipline.
Yeah, and also I think there's a lot of like still ingrained like assumptions about like macho culture and
yes, there's a lot of kind of like slapdash, trigger happy masculine idiocy. Okay, yeah. So Katie has written most of the question out here. I'll read it out now. It's a question about coordination across the radical left. In the US, you have the Marxist Center, and you mentioned the political conversation that has been going around about dual power over the last 10 years. How do we build this over here? Where do we start? More assemblies? Question mark, exclamation mark, smiley face. Yeah, so the Marxist Center is this organization, or kind of like a collection or coalition of organizations that exists in America. It's one of the larger and more coordinated revolutionary organizations, and it's not a party, it's more like a network of parties and local organizational groups. It's functionally an alliance between a variety of different communist and anarchist groups, and they're really oriented around questions of dual power and a connected concept called base building, which is about kind of building the legitimacy of like revolutionary communist ideas within the working class, and building like components of like an independent working class social infrastructure. So it's clearly quite connected to dual power ideas. I have actually wondered about where the opportunities are for us to build that sort of thing over here. So we don't have the same kind of organizational makeup in the UK as we do in the US. We've got the kinds of like big kind of splatter of parties that we've got are mainly oriented around the remains of the old British Trotskyite movements, occasional Marxist-Leninist groups, and then kind of like more general and more generic socialist campaign groups and libertarian socialist organizations. So it's less oriented towards people who are thinking about things in the way that the Marxist Center is. And it's particularly more oriented towards party and university organizing and like protest models. The thing that I think really exemplified some of the efforts the Marxist Center is doing is that they're willing to do kind of like deep organizational models, the kinds of things that over here are only really exemplified by groups like Angry Workers. So Angry Workers is like a very radical communist collective that operates in kind of west/southwest London. And they moved to that region of London to do deep long-term organizing within factories and other kind of like working class employment zones in that area in order they could understand the physical structure of struggles there. I think if we had that kind of effort on a much wider scale in the UK, then that would begin to build the institutional knowledge and the institutional experience that is required for that kind of coalition to emerge in a UK context. Right now, I don't think we're in a position where if we just had a coalition of British radical left groups, it would do that. It would probably organize itself mainly towards protests, which are fine, but they are not enough on their own, and it would suffer from the same kind of problems of a monoculture that the electoral position did, in that it would be insufficiently varied and insufficiently rooted in a community and insufficiently able to articulate its politics. Finn's made a comment a number of times about the degree to which the left kind of neglects care work, and I think this is pretty key. Care work in the recent crisis really became quite critical. I mean, it's an understatement to say that it was one of the defining features of the mutual aid movement. I think there's like questions about whether or not we can really tackle the degree to which we failed that, and failed to confront our inability to engage with that kind of stuff. But if we're going to be successful with performing the kind of organization that I've been talking about this evening, then we do need to pay attention to people who already have expertise and who already know what they're doing. I know what Finn's talking about in terms of the care work, because we know each other and we're in a similar organization. In terms of the land justice work, I'm not entirely certain what you mean here, Finn. I think it depends on which component of the land justice movement does exist, but certainly we need to kind of orient ourselves in a much more humble manner towards existing care institutions and existing people who know about the kind of the hard end of organizing and what that means. If you have any kind of comment you'd like to make on that, I'm very happy to give you the last word, because you certainly know more about this than I. Oh, and Katie has noted, totally agree that angry workers have an incredible amount of experience and knowledge, and it's taken a degree of dedication and discipline commitment. I worry most of the left is too comfortable in reactive protests, behavior, culture to dedicate themselves to this kind of work. That's true. Angry workers' model is not universally replicable for a variety of reasons, including the ones that you've mentioned. But if it were to be replicated to any degree, I think that would help a lot. Hopefully there will be other similar efforts. There's already another similar network in Croydon that's set up, which I'm sure that many of you are familiar with.
Andy, your pal, also wanted to ask something.
What's the name of that organisation, if you wouldn't mind saying?
Which organisation?
The one that's been set up in Croydon?
It's called Croydon Solidarity Network. They've been doing a lot of kind of angry workers style solidarity worker organization type stuff. They're right now organizing around a strike at a Pizza Hut that involves pushing for furlough conditions. It's very new. It started up kind of late last year. I know a couple of the guys who've been pushing there, and I have great hopes how it might develop. I'm still hoping that Finn might come back with a final comment regarding care and justice work, because I'd be eager to hear their opinion on the matter. Oh dear, I'm sorry, Finn. Well, it's okay if you have no final comments, but I think you've raised a really critical issue, because it's certainly a deep structural failing on the left that we aren't able to see the woods for the trees when it comes to care work. The other thing about care work is that care work, as we've just seen with all the bloody clap to the NHS stuff, commands a vast amount of respecting communities, and if that doesn't build popular sovereignty, then I don't know what will. I'm running out of things to say, unless people have more questions.
Yeah, they do.
Oh, perfect. Well, that's good.
Andy, your poll has been trying to speak for a bit. I don't know if they still have a question.
I'm very sorry. Crack on. Go ahead.
Yeah, cheers. It's just you mentioned food banks. You said that I think the leftists need to get more involved in food banks. I think you said. I wasn't sure if you meant that we need
not that they aren't, but they could do it more, I think.
But do you mean we should set up competing food banks? Or near me, there's a food bank run by a church and a food bank run by the Labour Party. Should I just start volunteering with them, or what how should I interact with them?
I don't think that I'm in a position to offer a blanket policy on that. I think it depends entirely on what the local one is like. And I would certainly say that unless the people who are going to be doing that kind of organizing are really experienced and know that they can do it better than what's existing, then you probably shouldn't be doing it in a competitive manner. Certainly not like an aggressively competitive manner. I think that is going to have to be something that gets decided on the ground by people doing that work themselves. And I don't know if I can really offer any particular close guidance there. I think it's more a comment on a general infrastructural weakness, and because of how much that varies from location to location, I think any kind of blanket comment from my position would be deeply it'd just be deeply presumptive on my
part. We also had questions from Jack and then Katie.
Hey, can you hear me all right?
Yep.
Yeah, so basically I'm not sure if I'm like completely convinced of the interpretation of dual power as like a strategy, as opposed to what I guess you kind of referred to as like the Leninist view, that it's more like a set of circumstances, or like a stage of the class struggle, I guess, in the Marxist view.
Yeah, I'm certainly not trying to monopolize the term, don't get me wrong.
Yeah, but I was just wondering, especially because you like mentioned the Russian Revolution, and it seemed like in that example that it does suggest that this is something that can arise like organically, in that I'm pretty sure, well, I'm not certain, but I think the people who set up the Soviets didn't do so like with the end goal of a socialist revolution, you know. So I'm just wondering if even you can like summarize some of the arguments about why we should have this interpretation of it as a strategy, or maybe if you can just point me in the direction of some works where like that's detailed.
So basically, I can get I'll tell you what. Basically, the thing that I've been using for my notes for this is a thing that I wrote about it, about the exact topic you're talking about. And I'll try and get a link to that. In fact, somebody linked it earlier on. If they could just relink that in the chat. I've got a large array of sources that discuss the evolution of the concept. It's certainly true that when the phenomenon emerged in the Russian Revolution, they weren't thinking about dual power as like a preconceived concept. And it basically was something that emerged as a physical phenomenon where one system was breaking down, another one emerged, and there were two kind of competing systems that came into contact with each other out of the kinds of coincidences that history throws up at us. The reason why I think it's a good idea to view it as a program and a strategy is because there's a wide array of kind of experience and theory that already exists around it that has been developed over the course of the 20th century by a variety of different kinds of leftist organizations. And there's also decent contemporary and historical evidence based in the kinds of case studies which I cited, like the Indian Maoist movement, which I didn't really go into in detail, but they've managed to kind of hold out for a significant period of time, and a significant reason for that has been the fact that they've been able to engage in community infrastructure projects. The reason why I think it's a legitimate strategy is because it has, to a certain extent, been tested in a wide range of scenarios. So I think it's almost like we've got like test data on it. Test data in terms of like viewing it as a program, and what happens as a result of if people do view it as a program and integrate that with practical activity. What is the potential for this? I think there is a history of partial results. Most other, I mean, the history of the left-wing movement has largely been a history of us getting stomped. It's been a history of failure. And I think that given that, if we do have models that have got a reasonable degree of success under certain circumstances, and we think that we can cannibalize bits of them to fit our current circumstances, then that's a legitimate way to go.
Cool.
Yeah, I mean, maybe data was the wrong phrase. Jack's just said can't get better than data. Perhaps historical evidence is a better term, but essentially, yeah, it's about there being case studies.
Cool. So maybe also to add to that, can you mute yourself? I think there's some echo. Yeah, so maybe to add to that, on top of the link to the article that Ben wrote, we're also going to have a discussion of a reading group discussion of that article and several others next week on Thursday, I believe. So I'm going to link that on the chat, and you can find it on the GAF Facebook as well. So if people want to kind of like have a more in-depth discussion of all these topics, and have like a reading list of articles and videos and all that, they can look up. Feel free to kind of check all of this and come next week. And with that, I think we've run a bit over time. I'm sorry if I didn't get to any question or someone had to wait too long to get their questions answered. But yeah, I think we are going to leave it here for today. I want to thank everyone in the chat and in the who has been listening and contributing. And I really look forward to speak with you again in the future. And of course, thank Em for coming here and giving such a great talk. And again, I want to remind everyone to please, if you are interested, check all of social media or website, and all these resources we have there. And also remind people that if they couldn't listen to all of this or they want to listen to it again, the recording of the talk will be uploaded to YouTube fairly soon. So yeah, thanks everyone. Hope to see you soon. Death to capitalism, death to colonialism, and see you in the barricades, hopefully.
Bye, guys. Thanks for having me on.
Bye.
Quickly jump in before you close it all off.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yes.
We have already got up our next live stream, which is going to happen in 2 weeks.
Oh yes.
And it's going to be on a very similar theme, and it's going to be on some of the things that Em has touched upon. So we're going to be talking to the Food Hall project at the National Food Service, exactly about food banks and community kitchens, which is going to be exciting.
Yes. So if you want to kind of get ideas for more practical ways to set up those kind of like food resources for people, that would be like one of the best places, because we'll be talking with like people who are actively doing it right now. And I feel
that would be a perfect example of what Finn was talking about earlier about going to sites of expertise about how to engage in really radical approaches to social reproduction. I think that's the Food Solidarity Network people did a lot of briefings for mutual aid volunteers at the beginning of the crisis, and I know that a lot of people found that pretty critical, and I would definitely recommend that.
Excellent. Yeah, that's a great closure then. So yeah, thanks everyone. See you all soon. Goodbye.